Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bali Gesing 96-hour hermetically sealed natural processed Indonesia from Kopirelo Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kopirelo, based out of Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. They were a suggestion to us by Roland, so a quick shout out to and thank you to Roland for the suggestion. We did pick this coffee up from Airworks as part of their April coffee drop, and if I do have this story correct, then I do believe Roland initially reached out to us asking if we'd be interested in trying out this coffee roaster, as Roland mentioned that they're one of the lightest roasting and best coffee roasters in Indonesia. And then we referred Roland to Airworks, and then Airworks decided to bring them on. So once Airworks decided to bring them on, we decided to try out a couple of their coffees, and Roland was pretty insistent that we try at least one of their Indonesian coffees. And I'll be completely honest, all the Indonesian coffees sounded the exact same to me given how heavily processed they were. So I just told Airworks to pick one out, and Airworks picked out this coffee and specifically said they picked it out because it turned out to be one of the more funky and intense coffees that Kopirelo was offering. So Airworks purposely did it, and it'll definitely be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly lower extraction one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I did mention that this one is supposed to be one of the lighter roasting Indonesian-based coffee roasters. But Roland also mentioned that they're not quite as light as a lot of Nordic-based coffee roasters, and I can certainly see that, as even with all the processing, I could tell that neither of the coffees that we had from them were particularly light. That being said, I'm not sure how light you can actually roast a coffee like this to begin with, so I feel like you could say it's probably somewhere in that medium light range, a little bit more developed than a lot of Nordic-based coffee roasters that we've reviewed recently. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and truth be told, I had no clue how long to wait on this coffee, so we just opted for the 3-week mark as a safe bet. And the first impression of this coffee wasn't quite as heavy as expected, as it does have a little bit of the fermenty aroma, which wasn't translating as heavily into the cup. It did present a bit of some grainy qualities to it, but it was pretty tropical in a heavier processed sense other than that, so it was an okay first impression, a lot of what I might have been expecting, but in a slightly more toned down sense. Day 24 through the Chemex, and the coffee, it definitely has a fair bit of funk to it in a number of ways. First, it presents itself in that kind of late 2010s, early 2020s Paraíso fermenty aroma, which I've often described as being, I don't know what a good way to say this is, but it does kind of remind me of moldy aroma in a way. But it didn't translate into the initial impression of the coffee itself, as it's mostly tropical citric forward, but it finishes into a slightly more fermenty but quite a bit funky, bitter tropicality. So a lot of qualities, none of which I'm particularly liking, but we'll go ahead and move on as we opted for day 27 with the UFO brewer. And the coffee was definitely still lacking the desired level of clarity, as it isn't quite as funky today. It is coming out in a slightly more boozy sense, which isn't necessarily ideal. I'm not looking for any of those qualities, but the clarity lacking because it doesn't have it in either the less boozy or less funky sense really isn't ideal. Brightness expectedly uneven, as the listed pineapple is also presented within this one, as there's an overly tart orange juice aspect. That's something I've identified as well. It's still just been okay. Haven't really enjoyed any of the first couple of experiences. We'll go ahead and move on to day 30 as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 93 Celsius, 15:1, and the coffee does continue to struggle, as it's pretty similar to a large majority of the heavier processed coffees we've reviewed in the past, with a very prominent tropical brightness and a grape wine-like booziness in a very uneven sense. Just a very heavy coffee overall, so this one is probably my least favorite experience of this coffee up to this point, which, given I haven't really enjoyed any of them up to this point, isn't saying too much. We'll go ahead and move on to day 33 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was a little better. First glimpse of some better qualities, as it wasn't quite as heavy off Peru, but it does translate into a much more heavy representation of the listed tropical qualities, primarily in a pineapple-like sense. Slight bitterness with a fermented tin pineapple and a slight bit of winey booziness in a bit more toned down of a sense this time around. And all those things were wins for me, mostly because I was getting a little bit more definition and I was getting a little less booziness and a little less funkiness. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe. And the best thing I can say about this coffee, especially as of this moment, is that the wild aroma in the brew and grounds don't present in the cup itself as heavy, as those are some very intense aromas that do come from this coffee. It's pretty funky, tropical forward, but outside of that, it does not reach the overbearing sense. It's just mostly heavier in the berry qualities, which are very prominent at the forefront of this one. And then day 39, final notes we have through the Chemex with lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee seems to have finally lost all of its structure, as at this moment it's offering an unbalanced, fermenty and overly bright tropical experience, as it's primarily skewing in the heavier and slightly more winey berry sense, with a funky and bitter citric quality. Pretty prominent spice tone to it as well, as it has a very long-lasting finish. So all of the qualities that I don't particularly like in overly processed coffees were presented in this one. That spiced feel, the funky feel, the fermenting feel, and the boozy feel. So all four of those. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. I forgot how strange this tasting wheel looks, but let's go through it. We have 2 level 5s. We'll start with the finish, level 5. This is a bad finish. I've mentioned before that whenever we do get the finish to a level 5 without any specific high level of clarity, then it's usually not ideal. And that's kind of the case with this one. It definitely leaves a very long-lasting fermenty funkiness to it. So not particularly happy with the finish in this one. We'll go ahead and move on to the acidity, level 5. Very bright coffee too. It has that uneven, winey brightness to it, which is one of the biggest detracting factors for me for natural processed Colombian coffees, especially anaerobic natural processed Colombian coffees. So having that one be as heavy and intense as it was, especially in that long-lasting sense, not particularly ideal. Let's go ahead and move on to level 4, sweetness, level 4. It's a very sweet coffee. It's a hyper-processed coffee, so I guess that's not really surprising in that sense. We'll go ahead and move on to the berry fruit, level 4. It has a lot of those heavier grape-like aspects to it, and given that I mentioned a lot of those Colombian berry-like qualities to it, a lot of that heavier berry quality to it, and that very prominent wininess to it, yeah, it's not really surprising that the berry fruit reached that level 4 mark. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the florality, level 3. I don't have a great descriptor for that. I just felt there was enough florality to justify it being there at that level 3. It's also a little difficult to kind of differentiate a lot of the qualities in this one that weren't in your face and overbearing. So level 3, where we opted to put that, spice, level 3. It has that quality that's presented within a lot of Diviso coffees. I've had it recently from some Wilder Lasso coffees. So it's that Colombian, not very clean spiced tone to it. So level 3, where we opted to put that. Citrus fruit, level 3. I mentioned pineapples, I mentioned orange. There are a couple of those qualities to it, and neither of which I would say are particularly consistent or well-defined throughout the entirety of this one. And they're also both presented in a heavier tropical sense, so level 3, where we opted to put those. Stone fruit, level 3, and that's a little bit more of that tropical stone fruit quality. So I can't see mango. I think they have something along those lines listed here for that as well, but it's also presented in a much more funky sense. It has that Paraiso 2020s, early 2020s feel in that sense. And then the final thing we're discussing, or 2 more things we're discussing, body level 2. For all of the things that I mentioned, it didn't necessarily have the most amount of texture or body to it either, so that didn't help either. And then the final thing we're discussing, cleanliness, level 2. There are so few coffees we scored level 2 for cleanliness, but what can I really say about this one? It's hindered in so many ways. It's hindered in all 4 ways, but it at least had a little bit of definition. I've had some coffees that were slightly less clean than this one. I know we've scored some coffees level 1 in terms of the cleanliness in the past. This one probably could have been a level 1. There is definition to the very intense wininess, booziness, the fermentiness. The fruits in it are a lot of the time pronounced. You can feel those. So there's at least enough cleanliness to push it there to that level 2 mark, but even then, it's one of the least clean coffees we've reviewed in a very long time. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I'll go back to what I said when we began discussing this coffee, which was that Airworks mentioned they specifically picked this one out because it was the less clean and the more funky of the 2 coffees that they did have to offer from Indonesia. And I can say that in a way we were kind of sabotaged with this review. But even then, the reason I didn't particularly pick out any of these coffees is because I felt like it was going to turn out this way regardless of which coffee we did end up picking out. I appreciate the fact that we did review an Indonesian coffee. I appreciate the fact that an Indonesian coffee was suggested to us, and this is supposed to be some of the best Indonesian coffee that's out there. But for me, I still feel like trying to compare an Indonesian coffee to a lot of the coffees that we normally review on this channel is very unfair, because this is everything I don't like about a coffee, if I'm being completely honest. And for that reason, it's not really surprising that this is one of my least favorite coffees we've reviewed in a while, as it offered every single thing that I don't particularly like, especially in terms of the cleanliness for this coffee. So not my thing. That being said, I've heard a lot of positive things about this coffee roaster from the other people that did purchase from the April coffee drop. So there were a lot of people that were pleasantly impressed by them. And we do have one more review from Kopirelo coming up, and I definitely enjoyed that coffee a lot more than I enjoyed this one. But yeah, that's my experience of this coffee, which does kind of take this into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. We'll start with, if you want to venture out and try an Indonesian coffee, that's the first place I should start, because that's what gives this one a little bit of uniqueness. And then outside of that, very heavy, very processed, very fermenty, very funky coffee. If you enjoy those in a very intense sense, go for it. This one offers all of those two things. And I feel like if I combine those two factors, then that's probably a selling point to some people out there. That's honestly the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bali Gesing 96-hour hermetically sealed natural processed Indonesia from Kopirelo Coffee. Thank you for watching.